Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm your host, Ben DuBose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. As we record this Thursday, January 12th, the Rockets are in the middle of an 8-game losing streak after falling to the Kings on Wednesday night in Sacramento. They've lost 13 of their last 14 games. They're at the exact midway point of the 2022-23 season, and at 10-31, they have the NBA's worst record. They're on pace for 20 wins yet again. That would be a relative disappointment because, of course, we wanted to see growth this year, not the same exact record as a season ago. There's a reason why the over-under figures were somewhere between 23.5 and 26.5 before the season. That's in regards to wins for the entire campaign. Rockets at 10-31, again, they're tracking just for 20-62 yet again, which could be the third straight season with the NBA's worst record. They are young, they are rebuilding, but you can look at other rebuilding teams like Oklahoma City and see that there's a way to still be bad, but also see some development, not just individually, but collectively as well from some of your young prospects. Hopefully that happens over the second half of this season. There is still a long way to go, 41 games still to play. Perhaps we'll see that. But right now it is frustrating, even within the confines of rebuilding talk. And as we look at how the Rockets got here, there's obviously a lot of angst among the fan base with regards to the coaching. We've done episodes here at the Lager Line looking at Stephen Silas in the past, but there's also in recent weeks been a bit of a turn towards the front office and people questioning the moves of Rafael Stone and even going all the way up to ownership with Tillman Fertitta, because it's not just a one-size-fits-all reason when a franchise sinks to these depths. Goes from 8 straight years in the playoffs, the longest active streak in the NBA from 2013 through 2020, to what's happened the last 3 seasons. It's complicated. There's a lot of blame to go around. Stephen Silas and the coaching staff is obviously a very easy target, but it is fair to question at least higher ranks in the organization, the GM, ownership. And so with the NBA trade deadline now less than a month away, Thursday, February 9th, this is a good time to sort of evaluate where the Rockets are with Rafael Stone, because he's going to come into focus the next few months. It's going to be a very big time period for him, not just at this trade deadline. What does he do with Eric Gordon? Does there get to be some resolution with KJ Martin and his contract? There's still whispers that he might be out on the market. And then, of course, as we head towards the offseason, that's when it's really going to be Rafael Stone time. Another high pick in the 2023 NBA draft, and then a summer in which the Rockets could have up to $60 million in cap space. So consider this the Rafael Stone episode, because focusing on the micro, what's going on game to game right now, folks, if you're listening to this podcast, you know what's going on. We've talked about it before. Really, things have not changed. So I think this is a good time to, again, do a bit more of a macro look at what's going on, peel back the curtain within the organization, and look at what's going on the front office side of things. We talked about coaching a lot. This time, let's go into the executive ranks and see what the Rockets are likely to do in the coming months. And I think a good way to determine what they're going to do is look at what they have done in the past and the moves that have gotten them where they are today. So to help me do that, I'm joined by our usual co-host and producer, Paulo Alves out of Portugal. Paulo, how's it going? You ready for the Rafael Stone episode?
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. These are kind of my favorite things to do. So it's, this is definitely one of those pods where I just kind of look forward to not only the analysis, but also looking back on how things were some time ago, because it's easy to get lost in what the present looks like. Mm-hmm. And from far away, just looking at some of these moves, it kind of reminds me of we've been in worst spots before not too long ago. It hasn't been it hasn't been too long since we had a 50% chance at getting a top pick versus getting Trey Man. So while it's bad, or it's not the best, it has definitely been worse before.
For sure. And I'll admit, going into this evaluation, we're going to do it basically in three parts because Rafael Stone took the job in October of 2020. That's when Daryl Morey left, resurfaced in Philadelphia. A couple of weeks later, Rafael Stone took the reins, completed that coaching search, and then basically he's had three NBA seasons, the ensuing 2020 to 2021, then 2021 to 2022, and now the 2022 to 2023 that the Rockets are currently in. And of course, because we do each episode within about an hour or so, we're not going to give it the nuance that each move probably deserves. We are going to have to move quickly, and we're not going to cover every single transaction that he's made. For example, I don't think we need to talk about the signing of DeMarcus Cousins as a reclamation project in late November. I guess it was interesting, but we're going to have to, for the sake of expediency and time, move past certain moves. So we're going to look at these past few years, the moves Rafael Stone has made, and some of them are going to be incompletes. We will give grades where we can, but some of them, like the James Harden trade, it's going to be partially on a projection because we don't know what's going to happen with the back half of that Brooklyn draft pick package. So we're going to do the best we can, looking at really the high points from each year. And I think the right place to start would be with the coaching hire in October of 2020, which was Stephen Silas, because Daryl Morey started that process. It began right after the Rockets lost in the bubble and flew home that September Sunday, and Mike D'Antoni told him on the plane flight that he would not be returning. Daryl Morey started that search as GM. Rafael Stone finished the search as GM, and it's been reported that Rafael took on a bigger role as the weeks progressed, and candidates sort of suspected that something was going on behind the scenes. Of course, they were transitioning from Daryl to Rafael. The three finalists in that search were Jeff Van Gundy, Stephen Silas, John Lucas. I do think it's noteworthy that Rafael was able to convince Lucas as a finalist to stay on and to be a coach for Stephen Silas. They were on equal footing, Lucas and Silas, at the time of the search. So just politically making it to where Lucas felt that this was a place that he still wanted to be despite not being the choice. And there were at least some rumblings during the search that Lucas was the guy. I can remember there was about a week in late October, shortly after Stone got the job, and people were talking about this might be Lucas's job. Ultimately, that did not turn out to be the case, but they did keep Lucas around on the staff, and I think he's clearly been an asset. When I look at the hire, I think it's pretty clear that it's not going to work out in the grand scheme, whether they fire Stephen Silas during the season or not. I'd be very surprised if he's back next season. There's something that isn't quite right with regards to the internal development and just the connectivity of this team or lack thereof. So I suspect that things may go a different direction. This is the last fully guaranteed year of his contract, which makes it even more likely for the Rockets, be it during the season or after the season, to really evaluate where things are at with Stephen. But I do think that it was a defensible hire at the time. The Rockets, when you look at what the organization had done in its previous coaching searches, really going back 10, 12 years, the entire Daryl Morey era, Rick Adelman, Kevin McHale, Mike D'Antoni, they were veteran after veteran. And there were a lot of people I can remember as a very active Rockets Twitter user in 2020, and I know you were getting started with Reddit at the time, that wanted the Rockets to gamble more on youth, which is what Stephen Silas was. He interviewed very well in 2016, was a finalist when they hired D'Antoni. Since then, he became the lead assistant in Dallas, was in charge of, I think, what graded out statistically as the most efficient offense in NBA history. Ultimately, the results in Houston, of course, did not mirror that. It's not all Stephen's fault because clearly they transitioned from having James Harden to going into a rebuild, things that were above his pay grade. But I also think what ended up happening is that the heliocentric system that led that success in Dallas with Luka leading the way, it was tougher to translate that to Houston where there wasn't that Luka other than the 8 or 9 games he got with James Harden. And I also think just his overall leadership style, not just concepts, but just generally his way of coaching and interacting with players was much better in a veteran environment, which Dallas mostly was outside of Luka, as opposed to a group in Houston that rapidly became very, very young. So I would say, grading that, it didn't work out. I guess you'd never say never. Maybe the Rockets flip the script and go 31-10 in the second half. Somehow I doubt that. So assuming that Stephen Silas is let go either during the season or after year 3, I understand why some will say, wow, that was just not the right coaching hire, and the record speaks for itself. Yet I understand the thought process of wanting to gamble on youth and upside, someone who, again, had a lot of pedigree. His dad coached in the NBA. He was a lead assistant. He came with strong endorsements from big-time stars like Luka, LeBron, Steph Curry that he had coached in the past. It wasn't like Rafael Stone went off the beaten path. Stephen Silas was a perfectly defensible hire. It just didn't end up being the right fit for the rebuild that the Rockets were sort of forced into by largely James Harden, and things just sort of spiraled out of control. But I do think that the thought process that led them to Stephen in October was sound. It clearly didn't work out, and at some point it is a results-driven business. But the fact that I do understand where they were coming from and they wanted to do something a bit different because, again, even though the veteran coaches they had over the past decade plus, they had worked out to an extent. It certainly didn't bring you the championship you were hoping for. They wanted to go a different direction, potentially go younger. So I'll give that hire a C plus. The results would be worse than that, but I understand the thought process, and I don't think it's anything devastating because, again, this was a period in which, if everything didn't go well, the upside is that you control your draft picks. The capital going to Oklahoma City has not largely come into play yet from that CP3 rush trade. That was, of course, pre-Rafael Stone. So the worst case scenario, if everything doesn't work out and there is more of a gamble with a young coach like Stephen Silas, then I think Rafael Stone and the Rockets knew, hey, we're gambling here, but if the gamble goes bust, then we're probably going to get better draft assets out of it, which is what's happened. So I would say C plus is where I land on that, sort of balancing the fact that Stephen clearly hasn't been the guy, and I would be shocked if he's the coach after this year. Yet I do understand what the thought process was in October that led them to choose Stephen Silas over Jeff Van Gundy and John Lucas.
Yeah, I largely agree with most of what you said, but my grade will be different because for the most part I'm weighing in like a results based analysis a little bit more. At the time, I wanted Stephen Silas as well. I prefer him over Lucas. I prefer him over Jeff Van Gundy because I thought that, as probably they thought as well, that he was going to come in and coach a team that was already full of veterans. That didn't end up happening, but that doesn't change the fact that they still deserve some of the blame for not seeing that coming. Because if James Harden, as was rumored, was already saying trade for Russ or I'm out the year before, and now you're seeing that it's not working out with Russ, and there's some all of that was going on. Perhaps a more flexible hire, someone who would be able to hold players accountable, because I think that's the most important part of a rebuild from a head coach. But besides, player development, which is usually more of an assistant responsibility, being able to hold players accountable and be good with rotations and stuff, that's head coach stuff. And Stephen Silas just doesn't seem to have the profile for it, and I doubt that he looked like he had the profile to be more of a hard-nosed coach back then. So I'm going to go with a C minus, just because, and it's no worse than that because I would have hired, if with the knowledge I had back then, he was my favorite candidate as well. So I have a hard time giving him a worse grade than that. But moving on to the next move I want to talk about, which is a lot more important than Stephen Silas hire. I'm talking about bringing in Bruno Caboclo on a training camp deal. I think that was French. No, I'm joking.
It's massive.
It's a massive, massive loss. I mean, he was 2 years away from being 2 years away, and now we are 3 years removed. We would have been getting the payoff of Bruno Caboclo had he still been here.
By the way, the most random story from the NBA bubble was when Bruno got basically extra quarantine because he broke his quarantine trying to get food, which was the most Bruno Caboclo story ever, that he didn't understand the quarantine process and went down for food. I'm sure that people look at it and be like, bro, you're supposed to be in there, like, you're breaking the seal. And yeah, that's the classic Bruno Caboclo story, which somehow has come full circle because Bruno was the guy who got crossed up by, actually dropped to the floor by Ty Washington in the G League earlier this year.
He was.
So yeah, small world. Anyway,
Yeah,
let's move on.
But so the move that actually matters here is the big one. The first big move for Rafael Stone, besides the coaching hire, was the Robert Covington trade, which to me was it's one of the best moves he's made until today.
Agreed.
He sold extremely high on Robert Covington, who as
has
an
fallen
asset
off the map since.
Yeah, he has. So that was basically the last chance they would have had to sell high on Robert Covington. We've seen them not do that on Eric Gordon, for example, if we compare it to last year. But they traded him to the Trailblazers for Trevor Ariza, who had a non-guaranteed contract, and I think pick 16 in the 2021 draft, who turned out to be Isaiah Stewart.
The 2020 draft, but yeah.
Yeah, 2020 draft, and the 2021 lottery protected first that was lottery protected for the rest of the existence, which is basically back then until 2027, and then it became second round picks. Getting 2 first round picks for Robert Covington is good, but the most interesting part of this is that this move was very clearly connected to something that they were planning to do later on. The fact that Trevor Ariza's contract was basically non-guaranteed meant that they could guarantee just enough of it to turn around and make a trade with the Pistons back then, which ended up being a sign-on trade to get Christian Wood. And so when you boil that trade down, they eventually sent the pick that became Isaiah Stewart to the Pistons in exchange for a future pick of their own, also protected. And they managed to get Christian Wood as well. And this was a huge deal because if you look at Robert Covington now, getting 2 first-round picks, although protected, and Christian Wood for what is a 3-and-D role player that never had the same amount of production that he had here. James Harden, at the time, they weren't quite sure, I think, if James Harden was 100% going to leave or not. But regardless of that, they managed to do 2 things. First of all, sell high on an asset in case James Harden was to leave. That requires a lot of vision because it's really hard to trade what probably was the best role player on the team when you're trying to convince a star to stay. And they got another player who fit like a glove next to James Harden, like we saw for those first 10 games, that, if they had sold earlier, perhaps could have gotten them a better return. But at the end of the day, got them a first-round pick in Ty Washington, Christian Wood eventually, and 2 second-round picks. So when you boil it down, Robert Covington for 3 first-round picks and 2 seconds from the Timberwolves eventually, that's a home run of a deal. I'm sorry. I know a lot of people, are quite down on Stone right now, but this move, his first move, was just absolutely genius. It showed vision to, toy around with the cap implications of bringing in Trevor Ariza, who was.
By the way, you said Ty Washington. I think you meant Usman Garuba, right?
Both of them, because eventually Christian Wood turned into Ty Washington, right?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Sorry,
yeah.
I was thinking Garuba because of the Covington trade. But yeah, when Wood turned into Ty Washington, correct. I see where you're going now.
Yeah, so eventually, actually, that's a good point as well. Eventually, it turned into Usman Garuba, Ty Washington, a first-round pick who we'll see how they used later, and second-round picks. So just, having the cold blood to do that trade at that time, and nailing it, and all of the cap, implications, the vision to see we can use Trevor Ariza to go out and try to sign and trade someone because his contract is so flexible at the same time. It was just a great move on all fronts. I don't think there's anything you can point to this move that,
to me, it's pretty clear.
Isn't great.
It's a pretty clear A+.
Yeah, Oh, sorry, I forgot about the grade. Yeah, it's a clear A+ for me. It's probably the best move of Rafael Stone's career so far.
Yeah, and I think it speaks also to having strong foresight, which is something that's being criticized now, and rightfully so. We'll get to it when we talk about his second and third years, when perhaps he should have traded Christian Wood and Eric Gordon a bit earlier than he did. There are some extenuating circumstances that I think influence those markets. But I do think that remembering what happened with Covington should give you a bit more confidence that he doesn't always do that. There's this notion now that the Rockets are just too conservative based on what's going on now with Eric Gordon, what happened a year ago with Christian Wood. And there's this thinking that they're going to hold on too long just because it's what they do. No, they did not do that with Robert Covington, and that move paid dividends in many ways. And it was really the perfect time to do it, because starting that next year was when Robert Covington's play definitely started to fall off. And if they even waited a few months, then I think you wouldn't have gotten anywhere near the value you did right there. And even if Christian Wood didn't work out, which ultimately he didn't, there was value in seeing what could happen. There was a stretch early in the 2020 to 2021 season where we were hopeful that Christian Wood could be a star. And even if he wasn't quite to that level, then maybe he could have the trade value to help you in your next pursuit of one. Ultimately, it didn't happen, and I think there's some extenuating circumstances that sort of led to him not fulfilling his potential. But I think just gambling on the talent, there's value in getting a guy like that and just seeing what happens, even if at the end of the day, the result isn't what you would like. So yeah, to me, that's a pretty clear A+. The other move right around that same time, and I'm looking at the transaction wire, it was actually the same week, two other A+ moves happened that same exact week. They drafted KJ Martin in the second round, buying a pick from the Lakers. They didn't have any. That was the point in which they were very just devoid of assets based on cashing in everything year after year, the way Daryl Morey understandably did during the James Harden era. But to get KJ Martin from a late second round pick that you bought, and you look at what's turned into a very good role player for this team on an extremely friendly contract, that's a huge win. And then they also plucked Jae'Sean Tate out of Australia on a very team-friendly deal. And, of course, they extended him last summer, and we're seeing him. I know he just came back about a week ago, but the early returns, in my opinion, very, very encouraging in terms of what he can do with his ability as a defender, a facilitator. But, yeah, that last week of November, after the Robert Covington, Christian Wood dealings, to bring in KJ Martin and Jae'Sean Tate, you could make the case that that was honestly Rafael's best week with the Houston Rockets, the way those moves set him up long term. So I think KJ Martin and Jae'Sean Tate, those are A+ moves as well.
Yeah, I think KJ it's just a home run. I was surprised back then because it cost quite a bit of money. I think it cost like $1 million or $2 to buy what was the 52nd pick in the NBA draft. But they did it. KJ was, for the first year, until we traded for KPJ, one of only two young-ish core players that we had at the time, because we were just straight tanking back then and trying to value assets to sell at the deadline. And then Jae'Sean Tate, I'll use this little bit to say, Jae'Sean Tate, his comeback to the lineup this week it just made a massive difference. The amount of heart he plays with, the hustle, the even just simple things, just as much as when he's the kind of lead ball handler point guards in neither Titan nor Knicks play now, just bringing the ball up with urgency, having players get into sets 4 or 5 seconds earlier. For a team that struggles in the half court as much as we do, to be able to catch offenses or defenses in this case off guard makes a huge difference than taking 10 seconds to bring the ball up, then running a set, and you're kind of playing in slow motion. I know Salas has made the point that he's wanted to do this earlier, but Jae'Sean Tate has made that happen. And so you've got to love him. He's the heart of this team, and this team plays different when he plays. Rafael Stone got him for free, just on a minimum 3-year deal, and since then he's already gotten an extension, and it's a team-friendly extension as well, which we'll get into later. But Jae'Sean Tate has been one of Rafael Stone's best moves, and I'll give it an A+. Earlier I wouldn't have, because second year wasn't the best, but I'll give him an A+, just because it was zero cost, and you've got yourself what I think will be a good role player when this team is eventually trying to compete. That being said, all the praise to Jae'Sean Tate, thank God he's back. The next move we need to touch on is the Russell Westbrook trade to the Wizards,
which was the following week, right before training camp started in December.
Exactly. So for context, back then, Russell Westbrook had requested the trade publicly, and he was already seen as maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more so today than it was back then, but he was already seen as someone who was declining. as someone who needed to be the guy and wasn't good enough to be the guy anymore, even though his season with Houston was great. He was also coming off an injury to close, the bubble. He didn't play, as good as he had earlier in the season in the bubble. He was actually one of the biggest reasons we didn't make it further than, I think, 5 games against the Lakers or 6 games against the Lakers.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was a distressed asset on a terrible contract, which is still running. He's still earning $40+ million a year. And he had requested out. This is basically the worst case scenario for a GM. And the only way you could trade a guy like that, even though he has been traded twice since, which is even crazier, but the contract was longer back then, was to take on a contract that's just as bad. And John Wall, if you're a team that's not sure how the year's going to go, that you don't have full incentive to tank because you only have a 50% shot at keeping your draft pick, John Wall is the exact, because of his contract, it's not the best, but he's the exact type of player in a situation where you'd want to take a bet on because he's coming off of injury. You never know how he's going to look. He might look amazing and his contract not look as bad and may be able to flip him. But you're in a situation where you're not looking for returns on the court. And bringing in John Wall and a first-round pick that came with him, to me, will always be a win just because of how limited the market was with Russell Westbrook. I remember back then we were speculating that maybe the Knicks have been kind of tied to Russell Westbrook ever since, but never pulled the trigger. It just seemed far-fetched to get real assets for us. I was expecting just to get, maybe a couple of smaller contracts that you can flip again. But getting John Wall on just as bad of a contract, but also getting a first-round pick for that difference between a albatross contract that's underperforming but is still at an all-star level, and a guy that was at an all-star level is on an albatross contract but has been injured for 2 years. Being able to at least get a first-round pick out of that, to me, will get a B+, because I think because Russell Westbrook has been traded twice, people underestimate how hard it was to move him back then.
Yeah.
But I remember that I couldn't see any way of moving him, and so it's important. It's important to realize that he's been traded twice since, but his contract has lost a year in between each one of those trades, so it's easier to move. Back then, I think he was 3 years, 130 something million.
And that first pick they got, while protected, it was part of the package that they used for Alper and Şengün. It was 50% of the package, along with that protected Detroit pick. So, yeah, there was definitely value in that, and it helped you bring in one of your current key pieces of your young core. So, yeah, there are some dividends from that still being paid today. I'll go with a B, slightly lower, simply because the obvious retort, some will say, look what happened in the Westbrook trade a year later with the Lakers, where the Wizards just largely fleeced them after letting Westbrook play fairly well in a low-pressure environment, much lower pressure than what Russ had been asked to do in the playoffs the year before. So I think that helped provide a bit more leverage to Washington, but I also think that's a clear outlier because let's be honest, that trade from a Lakers perspective was criticized by a lot of people from the moment that it was made. And really 2 months into that ensuing season, it was pretty clear that Russ was a big problem for the Lakers. They still haven't been able to move him simply because of that contract. I mean, it's just so insanely prohibitive. So I think, yes, you can point to the fact that the Wizards objectively got more for Russ than the Rockets did. That's true. However, I also think that's a clear outlier of circumstance based on the fact that, it took sort of a perfect storm for the Wizards to get that return. And even then, it was almost immediately panned. So that's why I go with a B. I think, it's certainly not an A if it was theoretically possible to get more. But I also think, or I don't think you can look at what the Wizards got and say, wow, Rafael Stone really messed up. Because, no, it's pretty clear that was an outlier. And if it was easy to get that for Russ, other teams, including the Lakers, would have done that since.
Yeah, but it's like the Wizards spent a year rehabilitating his value. Westbrook did at some points carry them to the playoffs there. But, I mean, if you are the Rockets, having Russell Westbrook carry you to the playoffs means you don't get Jalen Green. Russ Westbrook is very much of a floor raiser rather than a ceiling raiser, and that's the worst thing you can do when you're rebuilding. You wanted to maximize the odds in hindsight, you wanted to maximize the odds at keeping Jalen Green, and in order for the Wizards to get what they got for Russell Westbrook, first of all, they had to play him an entire season, which means less reps for, I mean, we didn't really have that many young players, so I'm not going to even say that. But besides that, it took a massive mistake from the Lakers, who I think was rumored back then were very influenced by LeBron to make that move. It just doesn't make sense because the circumstances were way too different. It was 1 year less of contract. It was spent an entire season rehabilitating him, missed out on a higher pick because of it. They also had Bradley Beal playing with Rust, which helped them make the playoffs. Who knows if Russ Westbrook even makes the playoffs if he stays here? I don't think it's really that comparable.
All right, let's move on to the bigger trade because Westbrook was just part one of that former iteration of the Rockets breaking up. Part two, of course, was James Harden. And this is going to be really tricky because so much of the Harden trade package was about Brooklyn draft capital that we still don't know what's going to be of it. They've gotten Tari Eason, and he's had a fairly promising rookie season. But in the 2024 to 2027 window, which honestly was the biggest incentive to that trade, whether the Rockets keep those picks or they package them and send them somewhere else, the bottom line is we're still waiting to see what happens of the value that the Rockets get from that Brooklyn package. And really, it's that latter window that was most intriguing because everybody knew in the short term with, at that point, KD, Kyrie, and Harden, that the Nets were going to be good in the short term. What you wanted was unprotected assets in the middle to latter part of the 2020s once guys like KD and Kyrie started to age. What's going to happen there? And it's still an open question. Brooklyn's looked good this year, but now KD just got hurt again in much the same way he did a year ago. What's that going to mean over the next few weeks? How does he come back? What does that mean for their chemistry? There's a lot of big questions, and this, of course, tends to happen as players age. So the Harden trade, the Rockets, they did that about 6 weeks after the Russ trade. The Russ trade was on December 2nd. The Harden trade was in the middle of January because, of course, Harden, a much better player. The Rockets wanted to make one last Hail Mary at making it work. That was a small part of the rationale for bringing in John Wall, someone that might be a bit better fit with James, see how it works. There was a decent relationship previously between Wall and Harden, despite all the, he didn't want to be here and the line that took off from John Wall and all the conferences, so-and-so wants to be here and as a clear shot at Harden. Before that, there was a good relationship between those guys. I remember when Wall came in for the first JH Town weekend that James did, I believe in 2017 or 2018 in Houston. So it was worth a Hail Mary if you could make things work with Harden, who was just 31 years old. That was something that was worth trying. And so the Rockets played this out into the season. It's also worth noting that Brooklyn got off to a fairly uneven start that year, and it was reported that that made Brooklyn more willing to give up all of their draft assets with no protections, which maybe they weren't going into the year based on the fact that the Rockets were perceived not to have much leverage. So I do think there were benefits in waiting, and you want to make sure when an asset as valuable as Harden, clearly Westbrook was that close, that you're certainly the dysfunction of having him around the team when he doesn't want to be there, that's a factor. But a bigger factor, of course, is making sure that you get the best or close to the best possible return that you can for an asset of that much value. And so in mid-January, Harden declared the situation was crazy after the Lakers game, second of two straight losses to those guys. The next day he was dealt. As I understand it, that was largely coincidental, or perhaps Harden did it because he knew he was on the verge of getting out. The bottom line was Brooklyn at that point was willing to push everything they had to the table. And this is a really tricky one to evaluate for a few reasons because there's basically two parts to it. There's the draft capital, which is not all played out yet. There's also the players they got, Karis LeVert and Jarrett Allen, who they redirected. Karis LeVert to Indiana, where the Rockets got Victor Oladipo. And then, of course, Jarrett Allen to Cleveland, where they got a future first-round pick from Milwaukee, which played into their PJ Tucker trade a couple of months after that. I'm still giving this trade a solid B, simply because I think there's a lot of upside with those future unprotected Brooklyn assets. I also like what we've seen from Tari Eason to this point. And I also think there's a very critical piece of context that people to this day are forgetting when they evaluate this trade. The Rockets were heavily incentivized to bottom out because of the unique protections top four on the 2021 pick that otherwise would have gone to Oklahoma City. The Rockets did not want to be in no man's land where they just sort of hover around 500 because then they would lose that draft pick to the Thunder. They were incentivized to lose big that year. And Oladipo played into that as well because Oladipo, either he was going to recapture the form that he had a couple of years ago when he was an all-star, a clearly better player than Karis LeVert ever was or will be, or the injuries just sapped him of that form, and it turned out to be the latter. But everything about that trade was about sort of giving yourself a low floor but a high ceiling, and ultimately the low floor is what panned out. And people look at it now and say, well, so many of these other trades, when you look at these stars, I've seen some of the comparisons lately to like Anthony Davis and Paul George. First off, Anthony Davis was 26. That's night and day from James Harden at 31. Just completely different in terms of the assets a team will give up because of the expected return in terms of prime years of that player left. Paul George, of course, was 29, so slightly closer to Harden in age, but that was also tied to the Kawhi Leonard free agency situation, which was incredibly unique for Oklahoma City in terms of the leverage that they had in terms of being able to get a player like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander into that deal. The argument, of course, is that the Rockets package is just draft only as opposed to these other star trades. Anthony Davis ended up getting Brandon Ingram plus draft capital. Paul George ended up getting SGA plus draft capital. But again, circumstances are different. Younger players, in the case of SGA, or in the case of Paul George, excuse me, there was a lot more leverage that they had at that particular time. Anthony Davis, the age gap was just absolutely massive. So it wasn't as strong of a hand for Rafael Stone with a 31-year-old James Harden, who was just 18 months from being able to become a free agent with his player option. It wasn't as strong, the leverage that Rafael had there. And secondly, it was very important for the Rockets to be able to bottom out. So that's the other part of this equation, is that the Rockets needed the ability to be bad, and that's what led them to Jalen Green rather than getting someone like Trey Mann from pick 18, because they ended up just being in no man's land and then having the pick swap activate and ended up getting the pick from Miami, I believe it was, that year. So when you account for those factors, I would give it a solid B, simply because I do think there is a lot of value right now in 4 years of unprotected draft assets, 2024 through 2027. I know the Rockets have only gotten Tari Eason to this point, but again, the trade was always about the back half of those assets. The first half, people knew Brooklyn was set up well in the short term. It's about what happens with them moving forward. And as we get to the ages, and of course, we see what happens not just with KD and age, but Kyrie Irving's going to be an unrestricted free agent next summer. Let's see what happens there. But yeah, there's a lot of instability in Brooklyn, and I know they're playing well now, but we're only a few months removed from when KD wanted out. Who the hell knows what happens with Kyrie? We've already seen James Harden get his way out. I still suspect that those picks from Brooklyn, if Rafael Stone wanted to offer them around the league, there's a lot of value there, that people would be very intrigued by those unprotected draft assets. Is it enough for James Harden at 31 years old? Probably not. But I also think that, again, getting more value would have cut away at your odds of bottoming out that year. And so there were a lot of competing interests that Rafael Stone had to balance when comparing something like that to, say, the Ben Simmons package from Philadelphia, which was one of the other leading possibilities amongst basically destinations that James Harden was willing to accept. Because if Harden wasn't willing to accept a destination, then, of course, with only 18 months of free agency, the package was really going to be reduced, since a team wouldn't want to mortgage its future for a version of James Harden that didn't want to be there. Look at what Harden had done the last few weeks in Houston. And I also think people forget about, when it comes to the LeVert and Allen parts, with LeVert, yes, I understand that Indiana eventually flipped him for a mid-first round pick and a second. It was a lottery protected first they got from Cleveland, where LeVert is today. In the grand scheme, that's not a huge asset. Like, it's basically the same as Tari Eason in terms of draft placement and the caliber of prospect. If you could theoretically, the argument I've seen is that instead of flipping LeVert for Oladipo, just hold LeVert and then trade him the next year's deadline, and the Rockets could have basically added to their stockpile. If you could add another Tari Eason type prospect to the current roster, does it help you? Yes. But I also don't think it's sort of catastrophic the way some people have made it out to be on Twitter. I don't think people would look at the Harden trade differently. And if you could point to, Tari Eason and one more prospect basically from that same draft, that you would look at it as something dramatically different than the way you do today. It's a small miss. And even the Oladipo thing, Oladipo didn't work out, and the trade at the deadline a couple of months later, we'll get to it, where they flipped Oladipo to Miami. They ended up getting a pick swap from the Heat that at the time it looked like would really help you the next year, going from the Brooklyn pick to Miami. Ultimately, Brooklyn had all those issues last year, and you ended up not using the pick swap. You just took the Brooklyn pick, which became Eason straight up. But it's not like Oladipo gave them no value. They did get something out of that, along with Kelly Olynyk. I know we'll get to it. But yeah, to me, the LeVert thing is just one of those things. Was it a loss? Theoretically, yes. But number one, I think he might have made your odds at getting Jalen Green worse. And secondly, adding another mid-first round pick, is that really that big of a deal? I don't think so. I mean, it's enough to dock it a little bit. But when we talk about the overall value of the trade, not a ton. And then Jarrett Allen, that's the biggest miss. Obviously, Jarrett Allen, although he's taken a bit of a step back this year, he's still been a defensive anchor for the Cavaliers. He's a difference maker. But at the same time, again, the same circumstances apply in regards to not wanting to hurt your odds at getting a top 4 pick in 2021, which became Jalen Green. You didn't want to be too good too early. You also would have had to give him a big time contract. He also played and still plays the 5, which is where Christian Wood is best optimized. So it remains to be seen how those two would have fit together. I think trading Jarrett Allen for a late first round pick from the Bucks, which is what was highly probable given the fact that they had Giannis in his prime, it's an underwhelming return. But I also don't think that if the Rockets had just kept Jarrett Allen, that he would have then turned into the player that he is now and subsequently had way more value a few months down the line. I also think the market value in the NBA for 5s only is a bit limited. So ultimately, it's a results-driven business, and a late first-round pick for Jarrett Allen, given the role he's playing now for Cleveland, feels very underwhelming. But when I understand where the Rockets were at that time in terms of their development, in terms of, not wanting to cloud their salary books long term, in terms of already having a player at the 5 in Christian Wood that they're trying to optimize, I understand the perspective. So to me, LeVert and Allen were always throw-ins. They were not the point of the trade. Could you argue that perhaps Rafael Stone should have optimized those assets better? Yes, but at the end of the day, I'm not willing to go lower than, say, a B minus, because to me, they're not really that consequential in the grand scheme. They were not the point of the trade. The point of the trade was all of that future draft capital from the Nets, the unprotected nature of it, and what you could do either drafting with those picks or using them as trade capital. And a lot of that is still to be determined. And while, again, I'm not willing to say, oh, it's an A+ trade because they moved, a James Harden that was in the MVP conversation a year earlier for, at this point, still wait and see. But when you factor in all the competing interest and the fact they did end up with Jalen Green after the year, they do still have all that unprotected future draft capital from Brooklyn. That is much larger than the LeVert and Allen parts of the trade. So right now, it's very much subject to change. I could lower it to a C or a D in future years, depending on what happens with that Brooklyn draft capital. But right now, there's enough there for me to be optimistic and give that a B. I know I was long-winded there, but there's so many considerations that go into it. Paulo, what's your thoughts on the Harden trade 2.5 years later?
Yeah,
or basically 2 years later.
Yeah, it's not basically it's basically 2 years later, but it is a notable date as we are recording this, and I think the pod will go live tonight. It is exactly 2 years since the famed "the situation's crazy" press conference. When it comes to the trade, I give it a B as well for most of what you already said, because you've also got to realize when a superstar demands a trade, what you're going to get is the maximum amount of assets a team has to give you. that the superstar wants to go to. It's really not up to debate. The only thing you can do as a GM is get the picks to actually be unprotected and get absolutely every single asset that you can. Because if James Harden's going to tell you, okay, you can only trade me to Philadelphia or Brooklyn, and if you want to trade me to somewhere else, I'll just have my agent call that team and say, hey, I don't want to play for you, so don't trade for me. And nobody's ever going to commit that amount of assets to a player that doesn't want to be there. So because of that, there's only two options. There's Brooklyn and there's Philly. Those two options bring two very different things. Brooklyn brings a bottom out and the maximum chance at keeping your pick and a few years of tanking. And trading for the Philly package brings you mediocrity with a very little upside long term. We've seen what has happened to Ben Simmons. He would have been enough to make the chance to keep Jalen Green a lot less than what it was in real life. So the first part of this trade is pick the right partner to trade with. It's the Brooklyn Nets. To me, it's by a landslide. After picking the Brooklyn Nets, did you get every single asset that you possibly could have? And except for second round picks, which don't really mean that much, and it's hard to. You got every single pick. Every single pick was unprotected, and you've got the youngest players that Brooklyn had, which were Jarrett Allen and Caris LeVert to some extent. I think he was like 25 at the time. So far so good. The part of the trade that came with Brooklyn to me is an A+ because you couldn't have gotten anything else. And so Rafael Stone already did a good job leveraging Philly to get the picks to be unprotected from Brooklyn. That wasn't a sure thing back then. And then afterwards, okay, did he miss on trading Caris LeVert? Yes. Did he miss on trading Jarrett Allen? Yes. He got underwhelming returns for both of those players. But you've also got to realize that not only did you get the first from Cleveland or from Milwaukee that came from Cleveland and Victor Oladipo, you also got the increase in draft odds to keep Jalen Green. And I know it's easy to talk because we got him, but that's factored into the equation. For sure. So could you have perhaps gotten more for Caris LeVert somewhere else? Did the Rockets perhaps overvalue how good Victor Oladipo was going to be? Probably as well. That doesn't change the fact that the big picture part of this trade is let's maximize our odds at Jalen Green. And let's set up for the future because this is going to be a process. And the longer we take to start this process, the longer it will take to get out of this process. And these years, like OKC not so much because they had Shea and Shea learned from it. But at the time, we didn't have any long-term pieces to learn from winning like Shea did with Chris Paul in that season that they made the playoffs only to get knocked out in the first round. Their year one of their rebuild after trading Westbrook and Paul George. That year is basically useless. All you're getting out of that year long term is a couple extra assets, perhaps an extra first round pick for each one of these players. The Jarrett Allen one, it was not only the first round pick from Milwaukee, it was also the fact that we got to dump Taurean Prince's contract back then, which it's not a great philosophy to take salary dumps as a rebuilding team, but you still got to count a little bit of value there. And then it was very clear as soon as the deal went on that Cleveland basically said this: we're going to offer Jarrett Allen in the offseason. We have cap space. We're going to offer him $100 million over 5 years. If you're not ready to match that in the offseason, you might as well trade him and get something from it. And by doing this, Cleveland also decreases the leverage you have around the league if you want to trade Jarrett Allen elsewhere. Because every other team knows that no matter what, they're going to have to match a $100 million offer, $20 million a year for Jarrett Allen if they want to keep him after trading for him and spending those assets. At the time, that was not obvious that Jarrett Allen was going to be worth that money. And when you factor in as well that Christian Wood was playing with the Rockets on a smaller deal and playing extremely well, it's a miss. But you can understand, it's a results-based approach. But you understand the logic behind it, right? And so that's why it's not an A, because those are misses. And to me, an A+ would have been, trading those two for the maximum return and the rest of the trade that the Rockets already did and got by the picks being unprotected. Because we've got to realize the ceiling for a James Harden trade is not Brandon Ingram, Kyle Kuzma, Lonzo Ball, and a bunch of picks, because that's not available. An A+ is getting the most you can possibly get within the market that you're dealing with it. Like it's not that hard to understand that if James Harden is only going to let himself go to two teams, you can only negotiate with those two teams. Perhaps you could make the argument that Tyrese Maxey from Philly would have been worth more than what we've got so far if you wanted to go the Ben Simmons route, and perhaps you could flip Ben Simmons to another team. If you were going that route, that could have been better than what we've got. But we know that Tyrese Maxey, for some reason, he wasn't as highly touted back then as he is now. But for some reason, Daryl Morey saw that in Tyrese Maxey and he didn't want to include him in a James Harden trade. So it's not the best, but it's also definitely not the worst. The worst case scenario is one where you take the Philly package without Tyrese Maxey, you take Ben Simmons, Matisse Thybulle, and a couple of unprotected first round picks, which was, I think, the last offer Philly made. You take that and you are mediocre for 3 years and then eventually realize that you actually have to tank and you're feeding picks to OKC when you finally make that decision. So that's just my thoughts in general on the James Harden trade 2 years removed. Especially if you can get, if James Harden comes back this offseason, that trade's going to look fucking genius.
Yeah, it would look amazing then.
Yeah, and so moving on to the next deal, it's a small deal that's
yeah, and
big repercussions.
And we'll go quicker with these. I think we can throw these two in the same bucket. PJ Tucker for basically a conditional first round pick for Milwaukee, and then the Victor Oladipo deal to Miami
we're missing
at the
one,
deadline. Though. What are we missing?
We're skipping KPJ's trade.
Oh, okay. You're right. Yeah, good eye.
So that KPJ trade, to me, that's an A+, no matter how you spin it. You might disagree with making him the point guard. You might disagree with how big of a role he has nowadays. But the trade
cost and the asset,
yeah.
And you love John Lucas.
It didn't cost anything. You didn't have any young players. You were basically just wasting playing time on Anthony Lamb and guys that aren't in the league anymore, like Kyrie Thomas. Bringing in KPJ as a absolutely no risk, high reward scenario just made all the sense in the world. He looked really promising to end that season. You didn't let him affect your draft philosophy at all. It didn't change anything long term. It didn't stop, drafting someone or signing someone because he's here yet. We'll see what they do in this offseason. So just as a trade, to me, that's a very easy A+.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't need to say anything more. We need to move quicker anyway. And I think it'll be easier to move quicker because, the most consequential one was the Harden trade. And again, I think even though there's some questioning of it, I think there's, again, some context being lost. I think the things they missed on are not as important as the things that either they got right or are still on the table in terms of how they're going to work out. Yeah, the KPJ one is just a home run in that you basically gave up nothing. You utilized John Lucas in the right way. That's something that you have a disproportionate advantage relative to other teams. You have a guy that players around the NBA, especially young ones, truly believe in, not just as a coach, but as a leader, as a person, as a father-like figure. And so in many ways, it was the perfect marriage. And I do think that they have made KPJ better as a man, not just as a player. I think they've contributed to his personal development and giving him a chance to succeed. Now, does he succeed in the long term in terms of who he is on the court? What's his optimal role? That remains to be seen. But clearly, just the opportunity for no cost, it was a home run. It's exactly the type of swing that they should be taking once they moved James Harden and they went from basically having to worry about chemistry to at this point when you're clearly in a rebuild. And yeah, you've got to take some swings. You've got to take some chances. That was a worthwhile chance. Does it work out the way people want it to? Of course, that remains to be seen. But yeah, you can't complain with the logic of the deal at all, or at least you shouldn't. Now we'll get to those two deals at the deadline that I wanted to discuss earlier. I was trying to jump ahead. PJ Tucker to the Bucks for basically moving up in the first round, and then Victor Oladipo to the Heat for Bradley Olynyk and a first-round pick swap that didn't end up activating. I'll give both, B minus, something in that range. Neither was a home run, but ultimately you acquired some type of first-round asset in those dealings, be it not a straight up first round pick, but something that could improve your status in the first round. To me, that's better than the second rounder if you have a chance to move up in the order. In the case of Milwaukee, it was basically moving up a year, the conditional pick that they were going to get because they already owned Milwaukee's pick in 2023, 2022. What ended up happening with that 2022 pick?
So basically what they did is they had the 2022 pick from Milwaukee that came from Cleveland. They delayed that to 2023, and
Yeah,
they traded up from the second round into the first
that's
round.
right. I was saying it. Yeah, they moved up into the first round, and then I was saying it wrong. They deferred from 2022 to 2023 because the 2023 draft was stronger and it was an extra year to basically see what happens.
Yeah,
Are there
Giannis hadn't extended yet at that time, so it was also a question whether
Yes,
they later won the championship, right? But it was also a question of, in case
and they
Milwaukee
hadn't
falls
won the
apart, they could
championship
have
at
been
that
worth something.
time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they
but they were
hadn't.
pretty much, and everybody knew the 2023 draft was stronger anyway. So yeah, I set that up wrong. They were wanting to push back to 2023, and then they got up into the 2021 first round, which I think was the Josh Christopher pick, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, for a 35-year-old PJ Tucker, that's fine. I would give it a B. Oladipo, that was underwhelming at the time because, there were some leaks the day before that maybe the Rockets get a first-round pick. Instead, they just got a swap and a couple of expiring contracts in Bradley and Olynyk, potentially expiring contracts. But at the end of the day, I mean, Victor Oladipo was pretty clearly washed, and I'm not going to judge it by leaks that may or may not have come from the Rockets. I'm going to judge it by basically what transpired on the court and what has happened since. And pretty clearly, the market was down on Victor Oladipo for a reason. You can question the Harden trade and did the Rockets maximize the LeVert portion of it when he became Oladipo? Yes. But in terms of the Tucker and Oladipo trades, neither of them are sexy, but I think both of them are, fine for a 35-year-old PJ Tucker who is very limited on offense, and a Victor Oladipo who, was in his upper 20s, but pretty clearly physically diminished, even if you don't want to call him washed. So I would say both of those trades are solid Bs. Nothing sexy, but nothing catastrophic either. I mean, they did reasonably
Yeah,
close to the best they could in both of those circumstances.
yeah. For the PJ Tucker deal, I'm going to give it a B, closer to a B plus than a B minus. Also because I thought it was a really smart way of extracting value. Let me just remind people that when PJ Tucker was traded, that so far in Houston, as a 35-year-old, he was shooting 36% from the field, 31% from three. PJ Tucker's never been, a points guy or a rebound or a really high rebounds guy, or never been a stats guy. But efficiency is important, and his ability to space the floor is important. And it didn't make it any easier for Rafael Stone to get more value out of him. The fact that he was shooting the worst he has ever shot in his career, I'm fairly certain, so far that season. So I'm going to give it a B, also because I thought it was, really creative. They used some mechanisms that are not that common when extracting value. Or front offices just take 2 second round picks or a first round pick. No, they managed to improve a first round pick. They managed to delay a first round pick that became more valuable. So from that perspective, it's a B. The Victor Oladipo one, I love Kelly Olynyk, and he was really fun to watch while he was here, but you basically got nothing. And so since I didn't discount too much the Oladipo part in the Harden trade, because I still gave it a B, I'm just going to give the Oladipo one just an F, because
Oh,
it's
really?
not
Wow.
it's not like you could have. It's not like the worst case scenario would have been to spend assets to dump him or something like that, because he was expiring anyways. So you basically you got nothing
Yeah, but
from.
I would just say, what has he done since? That's why I wouldn't give it an F. I'm
Yeah,
just
he
sort of
had
like,
so
well,
the value that they got for him was correct. The fact that they got in a position where they needed to trade them, or that they converted, or that they bet on an asset that eventually decayed so much that it had no value left. That's I'm going to punish the trading for Victor Oladipo in specific part in this grade rather than
okay.
the James Harden trade one.
Okay, I guess that's fair because yeah, part of the difficulty with evaluating the Harden trade is sort of getting bogged down in basically the smaller parts versus what you hope is ultimately going to be the difference maker that you get, be it the draft picks from Brooklyn or what you trade those draft picks for. So I guess if you're going to look at it that way, then yeah, you can grade it enough. I just, you might could talk me into, I guess, like a C. I just, looking at it on its own merits, I wouldn't grade it much worse than that, simply because I think it's pretty clear that Oladipo was washed, that there wasn't a whole lot better they could do in terms of negotiating, and ultimately the decision to go with him in the Harden trade was also based on the fact that, the high variance, the fact that if he worked out,
Yeah,
then great, he's an asset, and if he doesn't, well, then he helps you tank, basically, and that leads you to Jalen
Yes. So the trade itself is not catastrophic, as an F would make it seem, but the situation in a vacuum
Okay.
is fairly poor. So maybe not an F, because maybe an F would be, paying a first round pick to move him or something like that.
Yeah.
But at least a D or something like that.
Yeah, fair
Purely
enough.
because that situation was just entirely misjudged from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, and maybe they just overestimated his health, period. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember an article, I can't recall it exactly where it was from right now, but someone suggesting that other teams were much more worried about his medicals than the Rockets were. So yeah, perhaps they did misgrade it on a medical perspective. They didn't evaluate it properly. Yeah, I guess that's fine. You're talking me into a lower one for that. So yeah, I'll give a B for the PJ Tucker trade. But yeah, Oladipo, when you consider the context, yeah, clearly there was something on the medicals that was a little bit off. So yeah, I'll go C, you go D. Clearly it wasn't a good one. Let's move on to that summer and the draft. Jalen Green, Alperen Şengün, Usman Garuba, Josh Christopher. I'm giving that a B. The reason I'm not giving it higher, certainly Josh Christopher to this point hasn't worked out, but I also think it's worth noting that at number 24, most players that go in that range, you're looking at best case being a rotation player. And of course, we're not declaring Josh Christopher a bust just yet. He is just midway through his second season, but clearly he hasn't made the impact that, say, Quentin Grimes, who went just after him in that draft, has. So you could have done better, but again, that's not really the point of that draft otherwise. I think the higher picks, certainly Şengün trading 2 protected first for him in the middle of the first round, that's turned out to be a really good move. And then Jalen Green at 2, he showed you the flashes. I'm not grading it an A simply because to this point, Evan Mobley has been better. Now, I'm not freaking out by that because based on his player archetype as a big that's playing alongside some guards that can really create, Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell, and playing next to Jared Allen on the front line, a defender who can really sort of cover up any mistakes, having a true rim protector behind Mobley, that sort of plays to his strengths. And Mobley's not a creator. He doesn't need to be in Cleveland, as opposed to Jalen Green is a creator. And he's asked to do a lot of that in Houston because in a rebuilding situation, not much can. But even with those caveats, to this point, Mobley has been better. We hope that Green has the higher ceiling. We've talked about that before, that the choice with Green, first off, his player archetype, when you look at guys like Devin Booker, Zach LaVine, guys of that nature, they tend to take a lot more time to fully develop. And so with Jalen, you're betting on his work ethic, his intangibles, what he does in the gym during the off season, and then hopefully 4 or 5 years from now, you look at him in a similar way to the way the league looks at, say, Devin Booker right now. But to this point, at least, Mobley has been the better player. I do think there's circumstances that account for some of that. But we've also seen the flashes from Jalen from time to time that give you hope that down the road, he still can be that foundational piece for a championship contender that we were all hopeful the Rockets had acquired when they drafted him in June of 2021. So Jalen's the most important part of that draft, and I would say reviews are mixed, largely positive, but when you consider the context of Evan Mobley, the other alternative at number 2, then, I'm not going to give it an A at this point. Alperen Şengün, I would say that's definitely an A. And then Garuba and Christopher. Garuba has been a capable player this season. Josh Christopher not in the rotation for a number of reasons we've discussed before. But again, at 23 and 24, those are a much lower part of your grade because you just don't have anywhere near the reasonable expectation that you do with Jalen at number 2 or even Alperen Şengün at pick 16. So all in all, I'm going to give that draft class a B. I'm not giving it an A or even an A minus simply because at this point Mobley has been the better player. I was team Mobley prior to the draft, and so I sort of understand those that to this point want to say, why didn't the Rockets take Evan Mobley? Look at the difference he's made in Cleveland. But at the same time, you have to judge Jalen on a different curve. It's going to take more time, and we have seen the flashes. So at this point, I feel like a B is fair.
Instead of giving it an overall grade, I'll give it just a specific for each pick. I'm still giving Jalen Green an A. I would have given him an A in the offseason. I think the Rockets have, to some extent, failed him from a development standpoint and from an accountability standpoint. A lot of the intangibles that we identified year one have kind of faded away a little bit. Perhaps that's the rot of losing. Perhaps that's lack of accountability. He's not trying as hard on defense. He's been very inefficient, but he's also been asked to do stuff that he's perhaps not ready to do. And he's definitely not been put in a position to succeed as in a large part, none of these guys have. So it's hard to judge it right now, considering that I think they will look a lot better. Those will get a chance with a new coach or a new structure around the team. So I'm still giving Jalen an A. I still see in him the upside that I saw before. I still think he can be a good defender eventually. I still think he has some of the highest scoring potential in the league. I think he's really special in so many regards. That's still an A for me. Alperen Şengün is an A plus. Both the trade and just drafting him. I think there's some flaws to his archetype. You guys know I'm not the highest guy on Şengün, but I do think if the Rockets wanted to trade him right now, the perception of him around the league seems to be, glowing reviews from everyone. So I'm fairly certain it could get better than 2 protected first round picks for an Alperen Şengün that's on the second year of his deal. Still has 2 more years of team protection, and then he's a restricted free agent, and just looks like one of the typical guys like James Harden was in OKC before we went to go get him. That in a bigger role will just flourish. Hopefully he gets a bigger role here at least until the end of the year, because I think he has more value than he did. More value than we traded for him, and for the expected result out of the 16th pick in the NBA draft, he's clearly a hit. You're not supposed to get guys who have star upside and then look as good as Şengün has this far. So to me, Şengün is an A+. Usman Garuba is a C+. I haven't seen, I can see the potential. We're playing him a little bit. We see the flashes of a. I'll be careful with my words, but I'll say a Bam Adebayo light to some extent, like a guy that's, or maybe call it a Jared Vanderbilt, a guy that's going to be a great rebounder, great energy guy, play switchable defense. I think he can still become that, and he's cost controlled for a long time. So as a backup pick, you can easily keep him around the team. Just Christopher, on the other hand, it's hard to justify taking him. He wasn't protected to go that high, even though I was a Josh Christopher guy. He wasn't protected to go that high. I wanted Quentin Grimes back then. Bones Highland also comes to mind as a guy that they could have taken. Miles McBride was a guy that also hasn't panned out after coming to the NBA, so I'm not even going to mention him. So I'm going to give Josh Christopher a C-. The reason both Garuba and Josh Christopher don't get, more extreme grades is because at that point in the draft, you're more than likely not going to get an NBA player. It's just what it is. It's rare. You were talking beforehand about the expected value out of a first round pick when we were talking about Caris LeVert, and you said Tari Eason. Man, Tari Eason is a fairly, I think, at least I'm high on Tari. So to me, it's an outlier out of the value you're supposed to get with the pick at 17 or at 23 or 24. So based on most of the guys selected around this range don't make it, and you can bring up to me all the examples. I know Tyler Hero was selected in this range, and he made it. I know Brandon Clark has made it. I know there's examples of guys that make it. Jimmy Butler was the 30th pick. Those are very much outliers. Most of these guys are not in the league by the end of their rookie contracts or the year afterwards. So I'm not out on Josh Christopher yet. It's just it wasn't a great pick. So just to recap, A for Jalen Green, still really high on him. A+ for Alperen Şengün, and then C+ for Garuba, and C- for Josh Christopher. Just 2 picks who might not end up panning out, and that's basically what's expected out of picks in that range.
All right, so we're going to move on now to last season, 2021 to 2022. We'll go more quickly because the first year of Rafael Stone just had a lot more movement in general. That's why it took longer to discuss. Obviously, the Harden trade, there's so many layers to that. But also, that was the year that they were radically transforming. The last couple of years have honestly been fairly quiet. And of course, you can question whether that's the right move. But once they got that core in place with the 2021 draft, it's largely been about trying to develop those guys. They haven't really radically transformed the roster since then. So looking at 2021 to 2022, I'm actually going to combine the Daniel Tice signing with the Daniel Tice trade, which came 6 months later, because I think they are intertwined. Clearly, Tice did not work out for the Rockets. The 1-16 start to that 2021 to 2022 season was absolutely horrible. The lack of floor spacing with the double big lineup of Daniel Tice and Christian Wood. What I suspect happens, and let's be honest, this goes on all around the NBA. There's deals that are negotiated prior to free agency, and in this case, I suspect the offseason was still a bit compressed because they're trying to get back to normal after the COVID years. The calendar wasn't what it typically is. I suspect they already had the Tice deal lined up prior to the draft that netted them Şengün, And then once they got Şengün, obviously it's tough to play three centers, but they didn't want to back out of the deal, didn't want the bad will with the agent, because I think, one thing that Rafael Stone's clearly put a priority on is building decent relationships with agents around the league. We'll get to that when we talk about John Wall. And at the end of the day, Tice was a miss. Having a third big, another defensive guy that is not a floor spacer at all, was a problem for the Rockets. However, I do think it's noteworthy that the contract was friendly enough and seen by others around the league as friendly enough that the Rockets did not have to pay a premium to dump him. They didn't have to give up any future assets, and they ended up getting actually Dennis Schroeder and Bruno Fernando. Schroeder was useful the second half of last season, and Fernando is still with them, occasionally plays in somewhat of a rotation role as a backup center. So all in all, I would give Daniel Tice a C. It didn't help them, but it also didn't hurt them. I guess you could argue that, they did use their mid-level exception. So what if you didn't, if you didn't sign Tice, then you could have used your MLE on somebody else. But honestly, I think you might prefer the cap space, which is what they basically have now since Schroeder's contract expired, as opposed to using the MLE on somebody that would potentially clog your books going into the summer with all the cap space. So Tice didn't work on the court, but also the contract was clearly in alignment with what the league valued Tice as, and they were able to get rid of him. So all in all, I would give the Daniel Tice experiment a C. It didn't help you, but it also didn't hurt you.
The Daniel Tice, the entire saga, I can't give it any more or less than a C. It was a low risk, low reward type of move. They didn't even use the MLE to sign him, so they didn't actually lose anything. They had a TPE that was left from the James Harden
trade.
Right.
That's right. They did the sign and trade. You're right.
Yeah.
It was for MLE money, but they used the S&T.
Yeah, so there was a trade player exception that they had from the Harden trade that was about to expire, and so my guess is they thought we might as well use this to take a shot in the dark and try and manufacture an asset here since it's gonna go away anyways. So they didn't pay anything. It was technically a sign and trade, but the Bulls didn't get anything for Daniel Tice. They got cash considerations, I guess, which, I mean, come on. And like you said, it's important. They got nothing and they gave up nothing. So to me, it's a C, perhaps a C plus, because you lost a little bit of development reps to some extent, but that's just the risk of doing business. And it was just for the first, 20 something games of the season. They eventually, moved past that. Perhaps that helped them, be bad enough to get Jabari Smith Jr. in the draft afterwards. It's just not a great move. It's not a bad move. And I think the next few moves can be just combined, just because it's trading, taking on Sekou Doumbouya from the Nets for a second round pick, which is basically, buying a second round pick with cap space.
That was savvy.
Yeah, that's a typical Daryl Morey move. I'm glad that Rafael Stone managed to, or it's also a Sam Presti move by now. We got a free second round pick for cap space that we weren't going to use anyways. So to me, that's the way it's a B plus. It's not, you don't get, a lot of flowers for it, but it is better than not doing anything. And then the other two things I would mention are signing Garrison Matthews to his current deal. To me, that's, it's a good move. I'm not the biggest Garrison Matthews fan, but I think he has a role in the NBA, and they got him in a cheap tradable contract, zero risk with a little bit of a reward. I think Garrison Matthews could be worth a second round pick in the market if they wanted to trade him. And he's just, you've got to find some of these gem type players. Daryl Morey did it all the time. Ben McLemore is an example of it. If Garrison Matthews can be your key sharpshooter type by the time we are trying to win again, to carry some load during the regular season, because these guys never play in the playoffs, then great. You didn't lose anything. You didn't use the MLE on anything else. So it was a nice shot. I think it was a hit. It's not a massive hit, so B plus. And the other one is Daishen Nix. They got him as an undrafted free agent. They signed him to a similar deal, a non-guaranteed. I think it was only guaranteed years 1 and 2, and then non-guaranteed for the rest of it. We are already on year 2, and we're not paying any price for him not working out. I don't think he's long for this team, especially because they didn't even bother sending him to the T League like they did Ty Washington. But yeah, I'll give that a C plus. It was this guy was. And he looked great in the G League. He looked like a good prospect that just didn't work out, but you took a shot at it. And to me, that's what matters. So those, I think that's all the small moves that they did throughout the season, heading into the draft. So I'll just give them, B
Yeah.
plus for Matthews and a C minus or a C for Dijon Nix.
Now, one thing I will be a bit more critical of Rafael Stone on for the 2021 to 2022 year, and I'm going to combine a few situations into what I call veteran management. To me, this is where I do think there's some fair criticism when we look at how he's projected the Rockets roster internally, how guys are going to develop, what the needs are going to be, because the three veterans that they had to make decisions on during that league year to some extent, John Wall, Eric Gordon, Christian Wood. I think let's start with Christian. His value was at its highest coming off that first season in Houston. The second year, again, it started terribly with the double big lineup alongside Daniel Tice. Then there was the New Year's Day blow up. And after everything that happened there, it was honestly the first round pick, the late one they got from Dallas that became Ty Washington, was pretty decent at the time. The question is whether they could have gotten more by trading him in the summer of 2021 when his value was more than ultimately it was in the 2022 offseason. In large part, that first season, he had that great start playing alongside James Harden. And then they had that winning streak right after the Harden trade. And then there was some uneven play late in the season, but he also had that ankle injury. He clearly wasn't healthy. So you could at least make the argument that the time to sell high on Christian Wood would have been during the 2021 offseason. They didn't do it. Similarly, Eric Gordon, I think him shooting nearly 45% on threes, which is where he was at heading into the deadline a year ago, that would have been selling high on a guy who was 33. Now he's 34. He's not playing as well. He seems to be checked out to an extent on the defensive end of the court as well. I'd be surprised if you can get the same value for him at this year's deadline, now that he's 34 years old and not playing quite as well as you could have when he was having something of a late career renaissance in that 2021 to 2022 season. They held on to him, citing intangibles. Now those intangibles aren't really there. And then we can also talk about what happened with John Wall, whereas at the time I understand sitting him down to give more reps to Kevin Porter Jr., experiment with him at the point guard position. But we're also now at a point in which there's a lot of questions about KPJ at point guard. And we know a month into that season, the Rockets were actually open to bringing back John Wall into a smaller role. What was initially DJ Augustine, then Dennis Schroeder. They just couldn't quite get in alignment in terms of what that role would look like. And Wall apparently wasn't willing to play the bench role that he is now for the Clippers with the Rockets a year ago. But honestly, when I watch the Rockets this year and we talk about some of the issues from not having a point guard and what that means for the lack of development of the young guys, there are absolutely times that I think to myself, wow, they'd look better with John Wall. Now, I know that John Wall on the contract is pretty tricky. Of course, with the Clippers, he was bought out and he's on a much smaller deal. And there's expectations when you're making mid 40s and basically being paid like a franchise player. So there are some sensitive dynamics to that. But there are times that I've wondered, would they have been better off keeping John Wall and using more of a traditional point guard to help bolster the development of some of these young guys like Jalen Green? And who knows, if he plays well, maybe you can actually get a little bit of trade value, sort of rehabilitate his value the way that the Wizards did with Westbrook. We talked about that. Then maybe you can get a small asset for Wall instead of buying him out. And you give yourself an alternative to Kevin Porter Jr., getting back to something of the playmaker he was alongside Wall late in that 2020 to 2021 season. Not saying for sure it was a mistake, but you could at least ask the question. Not saying that they should keep John Wall long term. Clearly, you wanted the salary cap room in 2023, but just in terms of the way things are going now in terms of internal development, I do think it's a question that can be asked. And then with Eric Gordon and Christian Wood, you can also ask, did Rafael Stone hold on too long? Should they have sold high on both of those guys and perhaps gotten more value than what ended up being the case for Christian? And we'll see what happens with Eric, but I suspect it's not going to be at peak value. So to me, I don't think any of them are clear mistakes to the point where you can say this is an F. I also don't think any of those three, John Wall, Eric Gordon, Christian Wood, are so consequential or at any point were so consequential that you would say that managing them as assets is extremely critical to your end game in terms of building a contender. I understand it's sort of a small thing, but there's enough questions between those three situations combined that I would give them a C for what I would call veteran management, because I just think that there were some ways that they could have anticipated situations a bit more that would put them in a better situation than I guess they ultimately were when they made the decision to move on from Christian Wood and John Wall, and where they are now with Eric Gordon. So I would say veteran management last season, to me, that's more of a fair criticism than some of the trade negotiation stuff. I would give him a C on that front.
Yeah, so about the veterans, I'm not going to be as nice as a C. I'm not going to be as mean as an F either, but Eric Gordon in specific, it didn't make sense back then. It doesn't make sense now, and it's proven to make even less sense as time has gone on. He's clearly disgruntled by the way he speaks to the media, by the way he plays. Stone overplayed his hand when it comes to Eric Gordon. I don't know if an outright first round pick was available at some point, because I'm not in the room to know, and the rumors are a lot of the time just left that he plays. But whatever he could have gotten last season, he probably should have. Not only is he not caring now and not being that veteran leader that you want, he's taking minutes away from someone else who could be playing them, be that Tyrese and Caitlin Martin, and now Keshante as well, Jabari Smith, Josh Christopher. These guys could be getting those minutes. And even if you didn't want to go full young guys, you could have gotten a better vet to play that role. So Eric Gordon's just not the type of vet, right? And I think that was fairly clear since early on. PJ Tucker himself described Eric Gordon as the quiet guy, and if you want someone to be a vet to set the tone, it shouldn't be the quiet guy, because leading by example as a role player on a team with 10 other 22 and under guys, it's just not that. But you need a guy like PJ Tucker himself, or a Patrick Beverly, or someone like that, not someone who's going to eat a lot of minutes and not be that vocal. So for Eric Gordon, to me, it's a D. For Christian Wood, I was on the short list of people that wanted to move Christian Wood after year one, like right away, because I kind of understood that production wasn't really that reliable, and that eventually they'd have to trade him because extending him would be way too expensive. But I can be sensible and know that that's not a common opinion, and who knows what they could have gotten back then. I think they held on a little bit too long. I think year two of Christian Wood in Houston was a lot more about Christian Wood and the other players, and the other players were more important in the grand scheme of things than Christian Wood was. He clogged up the offense. He was terrible on defense. We complain about the offense now, but we complained back then because Christian Wood was basically everything. He would set a screen and either slip it into a post up or pop back out, or not, buy enough space for the guard with a decent screen to, actually get real penetration off. It was just, he was too much of a black hole offensively, and it just didn't make sense. But I can't give it less than a C or a C plus, because they did end up getting, a first round pick plus 2 second round picks for him. And they didn't take back any bad salary, so they got decent value out of him. It was just a little bit too late, so a C plus on that one. And then the John Wall situation, I'm going to give it a C or a C plus. Actually, rethinking that, I'm going to actually give it a B, because I supported back then not starting John Wall and giving KPJ the opportunity. It turned out that KPJ is not a point guard. That's okay. Now you know that he's not a point guard, and I think
he'll be over finding out.
Yeah, and I think he'll be overdeveloped as a passer for the role that he'll eventually play for this team as a wing scorer. And I don't think that would have been there had he not, spent this time playing at point guard. So I fully supported benching John Wall, especially if he was not willing to come off the bench. So that's a good step in my book. But moving on to the next thing, and I know we already talked about the Christian Wood trade, which was, basically during the draft. But
moving on to the start of the 2022 to 2023 league year, well, basically the draft period. Let's say the 2022 offseason.
So the Rockets in the draft, they selected Jabari Smith with the 3rd pick. They selected Tari Eason with the 17th pick. They traded back from
26 to 29.
26 to 29, acquired 2 extra second-round picks, which I think was great value, because there wasn't really a tier difference there in the draft. And selected Ty Washington, a guy that fits a need a lot more as a point guard in a team that clearly doesn't have any. Jabari Smith Jr. was the obvious choice. I wouldn't have gone for Jaden Ivey. I wouldn't have gone for Keegan Murray, Benedict Mathurin, or Dyson Daniels, who's on the Pelicans now having a really good year. So they took the guy that fell to them. That was the strategy going in, so can't really fault them for that. I'll give that an A. Would I ideally perhaps explore trading up for Banchero because I was a Banchero guy? Maybe, but I think Jabari Smith is a great fit on this team, and you can't really fault them for taking him at number 3. So that's an A. Tari Eason to me is an A+. I was not expecting him to fall. I think he's easily a lottery talent. I had him around 10 on my big board, and was one of my favorite players in the draft. And he's shown, and his jump shot looks much improved. There's some decision-making concerns, there's some finishing at the rim concerns, but I think most of them come from getting more reps, and I really believe that Darison will be one of the best role players in the league, alongside Jabari Smith. But Darison has his ceiling, and Jabari Smith has his floor. So A for Jabari, A+ for Darison. And for Ty Washington, people had Ty Washington as a borderline lottery pick. He fell all the way to 29. We haven't seen results from these guys too much yet to grade them, but I'll give that comfortably a B+, because at this point in the draft, you're not really going to find some sort of gem, or at least you're not going to know if it's a gem until a little bit deeper into their NBA careers. But I think Stone nailed the 2022 draft. I think the Rockets were labeled the winners of the 2022 draft by many draft people, journalists and alike around the league. So I think the draft in general was an A.
Yeah, I would give it a solid A without a doubt. It's way, way too early to start grading any of these players based on court production for literally half of their rookie seasons. I think you've got to look at it more holistically, just in terms of their value relative to the draft slot. Obviously, value is determined in the eyes of scouts and people around the league. Is it scientific? Of course not. But if that scouted value doesn't translate, that's a conversation we're going to have years from now. It's way, way too small of a sample to overreact to any of these guys through half of their rookie seasons. In terms of scouted value relative to what the Rockets did with those picks, to me, it's definitely an A. It was a good draft, and I'm still optimistic about it. The rest of the offseason, to me, there were actually some pretty good moves there as well. When they transitioned into free agency, the Jayshawn Tate contract was extremely team friendly, let him out a year early, and perhaps that's a template they follow with KJ Martin this coming summer as well. Pay them a year early on the front end to get more friendly terms, both in average annual value as well as some team options on that end. The Kevin Porter Jr. contract prior to the season, I still think that's a win simply because of the team control. Say what you will about his performance this year, but basically having him on, for the most part, 1-year contracts and useful salary filler at $15-16 million a season. He is still just 22 years old, decent young talent. I think that's a win when you look at what other guys from his draft class are getting. I think both Tate and KPJ on very, very team-friendly deals. Yes, with KPJ, there is, one brief window would be a 2-year deal. By 2024, you're going to have to decide whether you want to commit the next 2 years. But I think by that point, too, you'll also have a better idea of where he fits in the future. You'll be able to experiment in ways outside of point guard. All in all, I think both those contracts showed some shrewd negotiating skills. So I'm going to say those were positive deals. And then what am I forgetting? Oh, they also did the deal with Oklahoma City, basically buying a second-round draft pick by taking on salary and reducing the tax figure for OKC, basically the same thing they did with Brooklyn the year before. That's creative management. So all in all, I would say during the offseason, the Tate and KPJ extensions and then buying a second-round pick, it's nothing sexy, but it's very solid. I would say B+, A- on those moves.
Yeah, I think you forgot to mention the Bruno Fernando contract, but it's so minor that it doesn't really matter.
Oh yeah. Well, no, I didn't forget. I was overlooking that, but yeah, that's a solid move too.
Yeah, I'll file that in with the Garrison Matthews, the Knicks types of contracts that are just low risk, semi normal reward. I'll give Jayshawn Tate's contract an A+. I think that was a massive piece. Like that's exactly what I want out of a GM or of a rebuilding team. That's maximizing your flexibility. That's maximizing your cap space at a certain point in time before you extend your key core pieces. I love the Jayshawn Tate deal. It also seemingly made him play better, because it looked like at times last season that Jayshawn Tate was playing for a contract. He was, a little bit more tunnel vision. He went to his post moves a little bit more. He was passing less. This season, all of that seems to have gone out the window. He's, as sharp with his decisions as ever. He's always, putting pressure on the defense. He's on the defensive end. He's, just the hustle player that he's always been. So I think that was a great move, A+ for sure. The KPJ deal, I'll give it an A as well, just because you have nothing to lose.
Right.
Even if he pans out, he's underpaid. If he doesn't pan out, you can just waive him, and you'll find out if he's going to pan out for sure by 2024. I don't think that's
right.
That's hard to predict. And even if he's like halfway between panning out in a way that you're undecided if you want to give him that money or not, $16 to $20 million a year, depending on the incentives that he reaches. That's six-man money in this league, and will be by the time they start paying him that money. Cap's going to continue to increase. Just in each year, it basically increases from 10 to 12 million. In 2 years, the cap has increased by the totality of KPJs per year, cap on his current contract. So I think KPJs was a great deal. And then, I'll file the second round pick from OKC, exchanging all of those little contracts for a little bit of extra cap space for OKC for a second round pick. I'll file that into the Bruno Fernando, Sekou Doumbouya type deals where, you're going to be plus for that, but it's not a huge deal.
Yep. And that basically brings us to today, because the season to this point has been very quiet. They've sent Ty Washington and Josh Christopher to and from the G League a few times, but generally they have not made any big moves. They didn't spend their mid-level exception last summer either, because of course they're gearing up for this summer that they have all this cap space, so they want to be very careful with any moves they make. They don't want to take on salaries, be it signing guys or trading, that have that much of a long-term figure. So to this point, they've been fairly quiet, and that's why I think going to the deadline, most people are not expecting huge moves. It's just a matter of what they do with, most notably, Eric Gordon, but also they're getting close to a contract leverage point with KJ Martin, and there's several different directions that could go, both leading up to the deadline as well as in the off season as well, heading into his free agency, and of course the Rockets having all this cap room. So we've talked about this an hour and a half, longest podcast we've done yet, so we can wrap it here with just some closing thoughts. I think some of the Rafael Stone narratives are misguided. I'm not going to say that criticism of him is off base. No, he's definitely done some things wrong. I think sometimes people actually misunderstand where his mistakes have been. I think when it comes to, and people of course are very worried about Rafael Stone, because everybody knows it's going to be a huge offseason. You've got to get the draft pick right. You've got to get potentially the coaching hire right. You've got to get, most importantly, the cap stuff right. What do you do with that $60 million in cap space? And of course, Eli Whitus goes into that as well. He's a big part of their creative deal structuring. And, we talk about the finances of the KPJ and Jason Tate deals. Eli deserves a lot of credit for that as well. He's one of the more creative executives in the NBA.
He has the coolest name for the job that he makes.
He does. And
it's the best name ever.
Yeah, and let's also throw some love to Patrick Fertitta, who doesn't have an official title in the front office, but of course is basically the liaison between the front office and ownership. And clearly, I think Rafael Stone getting on the same page with Patrick has been a big part of convincing Tillman Fertitta that this is the way, and basically getting Tillman to greenlight some of these strategies that, quite frankly, a lot of owners would not allow their teams to sink to the depths that the Rockets have the last 3 years. And, it makes sense, especially with in 2024 to 2026, the draft capital load to Oklahoma City. Yeah, it makes sense for the Rockets to really bottom out these years, since going forward, they no longer have that incentive. But even so, I think there's a lot of GMs and or a lot of owners, I should say, that wouldn't take that pain. I think Rafael Stone
look at the Wizards.
Yeah.
Just look at the Wizards.
Getting Patrick to buy in, he deserves credit for that. So anyway, people are very focused on this summer for a lot of reasons. And of course, when you have the results that the Rockets have had the last 3 seasons, there's going to be nerves. There's going to be questions about everyone in the organization. But when it comes to the bigger picture things, the drafting, the negotiations, the contract structures, trade talks, I think Rafael Stone has actually done a fairly good job there. Not perfect, but I think most of the situations that we graded were B's or A's. You look back and he's done a pretty good job. Where I think the questions actually are more on the internal roster management side. When we talked about Eric Gordon, when we talked about Christian Wood, when we talked about John Wall, properly identifying within your own roster when is the right time to make the move on this guy? How does he fit long term into your puzzle? That to me is the bigger question. And I suppose you can throw coach in there as well, because while I think there's some extenuating circumstances, the bottom line, look, Steven Silas isn't working out, and that was his first choice. So to me, there are questions about Rafael Stone, but it's more on the internal side. It's more on sort of developing from within and what happens once you get guys into the organization. And perhaps some of that has to do with the fact that, he's new, he's learning. He hasn't been the guy in charge of that stuff for an organization, the true day to day. How do you structure your practices, your routines for these young guys? What is the right type of veteran to have around these types of young players to bring out the best of them, and so on and so forth? The true micro, the day-to-day. To me, that's where I think there are legitimate questions. And I think we can tie coach into that as well, because, of course, the coach you pick, it's more about how you mold these guys on a day-to-day basis, especially in a rebuild. It's less about the X's and O's, and it's more about just day-to-day having the right system, structure, accountability to bring out the best in these guys. To me, those are fair questions. And while I don't think he's had a ton of F's to where you just say, wow, this guy has no idea what he's doing, there are definitely GMs that do have F's, and Rafael Stone is not among them. There are fair questions for sure. Not, he hasn't made any catastrophic blunders, but ones that have definitely hurt. But in terms of the more macro things, going through months of draft scouting, important trade negotiations, decisions on where and when to spend money externally, having dollar figures that are in alignment with positive trade value around the league. That's where I think the Daniel Tice thing actually isn't as bad as a lot of people make it out to be, because it shows you that, again, he identified the right value that was in proportion with what a lot of people around the league saw. And I think the same thing is true with KPJ. Even if he doesn't work out at point guard, I think the dollar value is enough that his value would still be, as a trade commodity, neutral, and thus useful salary filler to you in the worst case scenarios. So when we head towards this offseason, I actually think Rafael Stone is a pretty good GM when it comes to the macro, when it comes to the bigger picture decisions and that are likely to define this particular summer. Where I think the questions are with Rafael, and hopefully he improves with time, is more the day-to-day, the micro, in terms of how he manages his roster, how he evaluates it, and the conclusions they come to. So to me, macro, Rafael Stone gets a high grade. Micro, it's a bit lower. And so to me, the questions with Rafael moving forward, it's less about what is he going to do with another high draft pick in 2023, what's he going to do with his cap space, and it's more about how does he manage this roster once those guys are in place? To me, that's the question that Rafael Stone has to answer. And with that, I'll wrap up my commentary on this extremely long episode of the Logger Line.
Yeah, in general, I agree with you. I think most of the macro decisions, trades, drafting, free agency, they have been from neutral to very good, with a couple of exceptions, of course. The questions become in the day-to-day. It's good to bring the right guys in, but then once they're in, you need to develop them correctly, and you need to have the right structure around them for them to develop correctly. We have not gotten any prospects that are, I don't think so, at least, even though I really like Jalen Reed, that are completely generational, the sort of generational like Scoot Henderson and Victor Wembanyama this year, where they can't miss no matter what. I don't think there's any way you can mess up the development of those guys. The guys we have need structure, and they need accountability. They need all of these things, and perhaps Rafael Stone's weakness thus far, if you can call it that, because we're not in there to know, has been that it doesn't seem like the team has structure. It doesn't seem like the team has accountability, and I pin most of that on Silas, but the guy that chose to get Silas in there is Rafael Stone, so he gets the blame as well. How long he takes to move on from Silas will also be, evaluated in the same sense. The longer Silas is, the more it looks like you are okay with what's going on. And so from that perspective, I think when it comes to GM stuff, Rafael Stone's done great. When it comes to, structure, and when it comes to the things that you usually associate with someone below the GM, which obviously reflects on the GM because he picks those people, I think it hasn't been that great. But both from a macro and a micro standpoint, none of that really matters at this point because the most important offseason is the next one, and who Rafael Stone selects or who Rafael Stone manages to get as head coach. Can we get one of the big names? Can we get someone who's going to, if not one of the big names, can we find someone that, unlike Steven Salas, is, holds these guys accountable and is a good fit with our young group? What will we do with our cap space? What will we do with the Brooklyn assets if we do something with them? What's the vision when it comes to a basketball team? What's the Rafael Stone way of playing basketball? With Daryl Morey, we knew what it was. He wants ball dominant guards, pick and roll bigs, 3 and 2 wings around them. What's the vision for Rafael Stone? Is Operating a part of the vision? Is it just getting, so far the vision is very clearly, let's get the best players available, the most talent available, and let the coach figure it out. We'll see, what it looks like at the end of next season, because that's basically not the deadline, but the time scale that he set for himself.
Yeah. And when we talk about the day-to-day, we should note that it can be the job of a coach to loop in the GM and tell them, hey, this is the right veteran to have around. Hey, here's a red flag. And if that's not happening here, then certainly it's a drawback compared to a situation like, say, the Spurs with Greg Popovich, who I think, the Spurs front office can definitely trust that Pop has the correct view and understands the micro, the day-to-day, what's the right type of player to have around, what's not the right type. And if you get the coaching hire right, then that may help Rafael Stone with some of these deficiencies. And so that's why it may not be an apples to apples. Say, if you make a comparison from Houston to San Antonio, it's not really fair to compare the Houston front office to the San Antonio front office, because there's a lot of things that the San Antonio front office doesn't even necessarily have to deal with in terms of the micro, because they can just trust that Greg Popovich is going to handle it, that he knows what he's doing, as opposed to in Houston, it's a bit more mixed, because since that's not coming from the coaching staff, then Rafael Stone has to be a bit more involved. Whereas in a perfect world, you would have the right coach and structure to where you can just trust him to delegate and say, this is your job, handle it. And I just don't think that there's that trust there right now. So I think the bottom line is it comes down to really making the right coaching hire. That's going to mean a ton, because you can fix a lot of these micro issues if you have the right guy managing these guys on a day in, day out basis. And I also think part of it is also going to be Rafael Stone selling ownership on investing in a big time coach, that Rafael Stone can make that pitch to Tillman Fertitta and say, look, I know this is going to hurt your pocketbook in the short term, but if you make the right investment, if we bring in the right guy, then it's potentially going to make me better as well, because I'm not going to have to be as involved on these fronts as I've had to be, and some of them have not gone that well the last few years. So I think sort of to tie this all together, and I perhaps it's appropriate, because before we get to the draft, before we get to free agency and what they do with that cap space, the first big decision they're going to have to make in the offseason is about the coach. I'm sure whether Silas finishes the season or not, they're going to have a comprehensive search in April and May, and that's going to be the big domino. So I think based on what we know of Rafael Stone to date, I think you can trust him on the draft of free agency. It's more the micro, and so perhaps what we should be talking about most as we get towards this crucial inflection point and the Rockets trying to win is making the right coaching hire in April or May. To me, that is, particularly when we consider it in the context of Rafael Stone's strengths and weaknesses, that's what's really going to tell the tale of the Rafael Stone era. Is that fair?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's will you bring in a head coach that will be, independent, that's going to demand his own space and is going to, kind of do like what we associate with head coach things to do, set the structure, his own coaching staff, develop and everything like that. And the other thing that I would bring up is there has been no major mistakes done yet that are not, fairly easily fixable. Are we a little bit delayed in our rebuilding timescale? because of these micro day-to-day things. Yes, these guys are picking up bad habits at a fast rate. Jalen Green doesn't look close to the same player that he was to end last year, especially on the defensive end, which is alarming considering his frame's gotten better. And that was one of the concerns. But the things you can change, guys that you draft, guys that you sign to big contracts, guys that you trade, those things are been handled properly. And so what's left to change is easier to change than the personnel you have on the team, the assets you have on the team. We are in a position where the right head coaching hire, for example, can make a massive difference in 2 years.
Agree.
If you give that coach 2 years, so it's a lot harder to fix if you drafted someone. If you drafted, I don't know, Jalen Suggs instead of Jalen Green, that's a way bigger problem than you kept a head coach on too long and there's some bad habits that we need to deconstruct. And so it's not all gloom and doom yet, but we are approaching a big inflection point in the rebuild. This offseason, a lot of these things will become set, and they won't be as easy to kind of steer. Once we make some of these decisions in the offseason, there's no going back. And so we are going to start making final franchise-defining decisions this offseason. So this is when it will become fair to absolutely judge the front office, because so far it's mostly been about maintaining optionality in most of the moves.
Yeah, and in all of these decisions that even if the worst case pans out, that it ultimately helps your draft pick outlook as opposed to next year. That's much less of a consideration. So you don't have that sort of to fall back on the way you have the last few years. And the one thing I would say, the biggest concern I've seen on Twitter the last few weeks is this growing narrative that is Rafael Stone too heavy-handed? Is basically Steven Silas something of a puppet? And we're not inside the building on a daily basis, so I don't want to go too far down the road speculating. You can find one anonymous source saying one thing and somebody else saying something different. But what I will say is that the obvious pushback to that is, what if the front office feels they need to be more heavy-handed because they can't trust Steven Silas to do these types of things that we've been talking about? Well, I think where we're really going to be able to tell what the truth is with this coaching hire, because these big name coaches, the types of guys that will bring the credibility and the structure that I think we both agree this franchise needs, they're not going to come here to be a puppet. They are going to want some level of autonomy. So if the Rockets get one of these guys, to me, it's a clear signal from Rafael Stone that he is willing to trust that coach, to let him handle those types of things without, driving everything himself. And perhaps some of the circumstances the last few years are exaggerated simply just by not having the right mix, the right balance between the head coach and the GM, as opposed to, if there's an underwhelming hire, then maybe that does suggest that, some of the bigger name coaches, the guys with more options, just were turned off because they don't think they're going to have the structure that they need to succeed here. They're not going to be able to do what it takes to maximize their abilities as a leader and someone that's really big out there. When you look at the potential names out there, Kenny Atkinson, Frank Vogel, those types, they're going to want some degree of autonomy. And if the Rockets can't lure them, I guess you can say some of it could be money. And so Rafael Stone's going to have to make the pitch to Tillman Fertitta on why to invest. But also, I think just the nature of the coach will sort of tell you whether Rafael Stone is willing to take the step back, and whether some of the circumstances now are perhaps simply because the fit just isn't right. And there's some things that Rafael Stone perhaps shouldn't handle, but feels he sort of has to handle because there's not, complete trust in what the Steven Silas administration is doing.
Yeah, and just to close it out, when we're talking about GMs, I think it's very easy to get lost pinpointing what the GM's done wrong. We usually do it with hindsight, and I'll just like to kind of explain my view when it comes to judging a GM. I think GMs around the league, there are a lot of incompetent GMs around the league. That there's a reason a team like the Washington Wizards has been middling for God knows how long. The San Antonio Spurs up until last year were middling for God knows how long. The Knicks, the same thing. In the NBA, we don't want to be near the bottom or near the top. This to say that the way I judge a GM is you've got before you ask for someone to be fired, you need to be confident that the next guy that's coming in is not going to be worse. Because in high likelihood, I still believe anybody or most of the candidates that could come after Rafael Stone could very easily be worse, because GM's not the most talented positions around the league. A lot of teams get good because of sheer luck. A lot of teams stumble into good players, and then make terrible decisions around them. I mean, look at the Portland Trailblazers last year when they were kind of stripping down the team around Damian Lillard. They made 2-3 terrible trades. Everybody was mocking the Trailblazers. So my way of viewing GM is, as long as there's the direction, and as long as you're not making franchise-altering decisions that are negative, I'll call them franchise-dooming decisions, then I can't really expect that much more, because most front offices aren't that good. Most front offices just stumble into talent. And how much of building a team nowadays is your star being friends with another star and them coming and joining your team. It's very often not organic to build an NBA team. And so
we don't use the term organic.
Oh no. By the way, if Steven Silas gets fired or not rehired, the organic learning things is just not true, because otherwise they would just
dead.
Bring him back.
Yeah.
No, but get back to what I was saying. Before you call for a GM to be fired, go around the league and try to figure out how many GMs would you rather have on your team than the current one. Because a lot of the time, I mean, look at the Kings. A lot of the time GMs come in and they're not successful, and they're even worse than the guy that was there before. So no, that will just be my heads up. I think Rafael Stone is not perfect. He has made some mistakes. I think that it will be a lot easier to judge him after next offseason. But it's really easy to get lost on the day-to-day and start calling for people's jobs, especially because head coaches, there's a lot of them, and you can basically, you can tell how good a head coach is by their past jobs. How many guys in the league that become GMs are just first-time GMs, guys that were on a structure beforehand that you have no clue about? You could get anything from a guy like that. You could get a really good GM and a really poor GM. And it's really easy to go down that hole. I bet if people kept up on a day-to-day basis with a lot of these other teams, the gap between what we have and what they have would seem a lot less. Even if there might be some gap, it will seem like a lot less than what it looks like, because usually when we look at our other teams from the outside, we only look at the highlights. And most people complain, if you look from the outside to the Rockets only at just the highlights and the lowlights, then you'd probably think the Rockets are in a better situation than they are, and that happens with the rest of the teams in the league. Living the day-to-day grind, which is what most people are complaining about, the lack of progress, the lack of system, those types of things, those come from the day-to-day of watching an NBA team. If you did that to other NBA teams, you'd probably find that we're not we're not as far behind as most people would say that we are.
That's a nice optimistic note to leave on, and I'm going to break it here because guess what? We held this under 2 hours somehow. By far our longest, but come on, when we're trying to evaluate a GM over nearly 3 seasons, of course it's going to take a long time, and hopefully this is a good primer. I think one of the benefits to this episode is that it's something that people can refer back to really leading up to the offseason, because I doubt there's anything too massive to shape Rafael's legacy at the upcoming trade deadline. I mean, there's certainly some little things on the margins you could do. Eric Gordon at the forefront of that list, but I don't think it's going to be anything dramatic. So I think hopefully the talking points that we've gone through today are going to be valid for the next few months as people try and get a handle on what's happened and hasn't happened with Rafael Stone over his first 3 seasons with the Houston Rockets as general manager. With that, we will finally bring this to a close. For Paulo, I'm Ben. The best place to get more from us before our next episode in a week or so will be on Twitter. I'm on there at Ben DuBose. Paulo is on there at Paulo Alves NBA, and this show is on there at The Logger Line. If you go to The Logger Line on Twitter, you can find our link tree, which is, quite frankly, the best place for information on this show. You can find where you can listen on your platform of choice, Apple, Google, Spotify, any distributor that you want. You can also find links to our partners and sponsors, Carback Brewing, Sports Talk 790, Rockets Wire. You can access their content as well. All of it available through our link tree. The easiest way to get to that, of course, is through our Twitter page at twitter.com/theloggerline. With that, we'll wrap up. For Paulo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.